Um, I'd like to start this dive into Eckhart with a quote by Merton, one of the most helpful quotes of his many great quotes. You could spend your whole life if you're a quoteaholic just digging through these great sentences by Merton. And this is one of them. He said, "Your life is shaped by the end you live for. Your life is shaped by the end you live for." These great sentences are often 10 words or less. Your life is shaped by the end you live for. So then the question from that comes, what end are you living for? Okay. And I want to just throw out a kind of mnemonic I worked over the years as I tried to work with this question itself. I mean, what's the end behind, you know, all the stuff that's going on the planet? What's the end of all that? And maybe we really haven't looked at it. We really haven't looked at it. Your life is, and I don't just mean your life, because this is a collective thing. We're on this planet. This is a collective thing. So our life is shaped by the end we live for. It's a we, where nobody's in this alone, but, there's two levels there. Well, I have a kind of mnemonic called the 8 Ps. And you might find out in some of these words starting with P, pretty much you get a view of what people are living for on this planet. First P, power. You're living for power. Are you living for profit? Is the bottom line really the bottom line? These are measurable things you see. This is the superficial world where you can actually measure. You're going to make more money this year than you made last year. You're going to be number one on the Forbes 500. You can measure that. And power, you win an election. You become the CEO. You become to the top of the business ladder or something. So power, profit, possessions. Once saw a girl wearing the T-shirt, "Whoever dies with the most toys wins." Well, that's certainly that's what at least the person who did that T-shirt thought that was what it was living for. Anybody who's older as I am is trying to get rid of some of this stuff. You're drowning in stuff. Yeah. So power, profit, possessions, prestige. How many likes on my latest post? The current crop of people, there's a new job afoot called influencers. That's what they do. They try to influence other people, and they can tell by how the number of hits they got. Well, then they become hits on the internet, then they're an influencer. So it's the idea of prestige. So power, profit, possessions, prestige. The fifth P is pleasure. You hear about some of these super yachts, but then, a little subcategory is just comfort. Our power went out yesterday for 6 or 7 hours, and had to talk to Jill that maybe she was going to have to take over, et cetera, but it came back on. But at first I was a little freaked out, and then I realized, well, hell, I'm in a house, I got a wood stove, I got peanut butter and bread. It's all of those things are more than most of the people on the planet have in terms of comfort. I was a little bit out of my comfort zone. I flipped a few switches, nothing came on, that kind of thing. But so those five are very strong. There's a lot of gravity in our culture, being what it is, would say some combination of those five are what you got to be shooting for: power, profit, possessions, prestige, or pleasure, comfort. Okay. Well, there's three more. There's people. It's part of my chant to invite my what I call my poor ill brothers and sisters into the Zendo when I sit in the morning. I said, welcome, poor brothers and sisters who value power, profit, possessions, prestige, or pleasure more than people. I mean, more than the planet. And finally, more than the presence itself that sustains all of this. So those are the eight P's that you work with, and there's a kind of dividing line. When they asked Jesus what was the most important commandment, he went to the top three. He said, love the presence with your whole heart, soul, mind, body, and love your neighbor as yourself. And as we'll see when we get into Meister Eckhart, your neighbor is not just the person who lives, my neighbor lives a ways away. It's the earth itself, the air, the water. What was rare about Eckhart in the 14th century is that he had an ecological sensibility way back then that all of creation was sacred, as are we. You have to treat everything as sacred. We're not near that sensibility, but that's what's going to pull us, I think, what's going to pull us out of the fire. It's why, literally out of the fire of what's happening on this planet. But then look at these people. Are they your neighbors? Are the Palestinians your neighbor? Are the Israelis your neighbor? Are the Ukrainians and the Russians your neighbors? Well, yeah, they are. They're all precious, sacred human beings that are just slaughtered. And so you start to shift to what you're living for. There's a big difference if you're living for people, the planet, and the presence. And Meister Eckhart is pointing that direction. Yeah. And now the last talk I gave, to piggyback on that, and then I've got a poem for today, was you're the end you could choose to put it in another form. Those top three that I mentioned, people, the planet, and the presence, you could live to become a mystic healer. And we're going to unpack mystic a little bit in the poem today. But you could be a person to heal what's going on the planet, to heal the wounds, personal, interpersonal, interspecies, interplanetary, interdivinity. All the wounds there. We all have a lot personally, and that's our first thing. But how do we do that healing? Well, I want to deal with that in this poem. This is the poem I wrote this week. And some of you know this real well, but there's a few people who haven't been here before, and so I want to do this short Sufi parable, which is one of my favorites. 10,000 waves rolling towards the Arabian Peninsula, and one wave that's just breaking sees this older, taller wave and sort of waves over to it and says, classic, novice master kind of story. And he says, hey, I've got a question. You've been around longer than I have. Maybe you got the answer. Yeah, well, what is it? He says, I heard about this thing called the ocean. Have you ever heard about it? He says, yes, I've heard about it, but I've never actually seen one. Now, to me, that's the whole conundrum right there in terms of imagery of wave and ocean. So this is called the mystic wave. And this is very much the things you need to unpack if you decide, well, yeah, I mean, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a citizen. There's a lot of roles that neighbor, there's a lot of roles you are, but you could also say, well, gee, I want to be a mystic healer. It's not so far out of reach. Mystics aren't like living in the Himalayas or something. Anybody could be a mystic healer. So this is called the mystic wave. A mystic is someone who relates to God directly and is transformed and healed over time and eternally by the experience. That's the first thing. And I'll come back, we'll reflect on it. But I'll repeat it. A mystic is someone who relates to God, the great mystery. You might like that term better, and there's a bunch of other terms for it and different things, but a mystic is a person who relates to this great mystery called God, directly as and is transformed and healed over time and eventually by the experience. It's not talking about it, which we do. That has part of it too. I'm talking about it now. But in a few minutes, we'll actually be in the silence and each have a chance to meet directly in the silence, you see. But that's what a mystic does, is one who's sort of geared on a regular basis to run this experiment called meditation, also called taking a walk and just seeing what you're walking through. You don't have to be sitting down to do meditation. There's a lot of forms, but it's basically direct contact with ultimate reality. Another good term for God, ultimate reality. And when you're direct contact, if there's a difference between walking this road with listen to a podcast or walking this road thinking about my problems and just walking this road and being wholeheartedly aware of what I'm walking through. The trees, the bird song, the feel of the gravel, the temperature, there's a big difference there. A mystic is a wave who realizes that it is all ocean all the time. No matter if it's a tsunami or a tiny bit of foam losing its form and sliding back down the beach. Mystic is a wave who realizes that it's all ocean all the time. No matter if it's a tsunami or a tiny bit of foam losing its form as it slides down the beach. A mystic knows in each cell of their body that God is in each of us, and we are in God. The 14th century mystic, Meister Eckhart, lamented that, and this is from one of his sermons. He lamented that God is within us, but we are outside. God is at home in us, but we are abroad. I love that. I love that little lament. God is within us, but we are outside. God is at home in us, but we are abroad. A mystic wave lives to awaken and heal any wave who claims, oh yes, I've heard of the ocean, but I've never actually seen one. Mystic wave lives to awaken and heal any wave who claims, oh yes, I've heard of the ocean, but I've never actually seen one. So in this setup, of course, that Sufi thing, you can explain so much. What's the difference between the soul and the spirit? What's the difference between an individual wave and the ocean? Yeah. And with our, I don't know why we need to do this, but we say there are 7 oceans or maybe 8, depending on who you listen to. No, there's just one. You see it from the moon, the first picture of the whole Earth. You could see it was this blue water planet with a lot of green in it. What a precious jewel it is still, even though it's been pretty well devastated. They're just one ocean. We can tease it apart for useful reasons, but they're just one body of water. There's just one spirit. We can have different religions, different practices, whatever, but there's one spirit. But there's, billions of souls, billions of waves. How many of them know that they're all ocean all the time? How many of them know that, like a fish, the wave's neighbor, well, the ocean keeps coming in and out of the fish. Without the only time they realize what water is, I guess, is when they're pulled up on a hook. Then they realize, oh shit. Yeah, and maybe that's why sometimes we realize the divine when we're jerked out of our comfort zone. Say, like especially you get a diagnosis or have a horrible breakup, lose a job. It's like the fish pulled out of the water. Yeah. Now, all of this poem describes, Meister Eckhart was part of why he was condemned and excommunicated post mortem after he died uh, was he was branded as a pantheist. And a pantheist thinks everything is God, and in this tradition of making statements against about the reality, about the great mystery. We can't help it. I'm doing it for 20 minutes, 30 minutes here, talking about the great mystery and our place in it. Um, you can get a leaner and but not get a ringer. And what Eckhart claimed, he said, "No, I'm not a pantheist. I'm a panentheist." Had an en there. Uh, that God is in everything and everything is in God. But think about the wave, for instance. If the wave, got a little enlightenment, you think, well, I'm nothing but God. Therefore, I'm God. And well, yeah, no. He's going to, he's a little bit crazy because no wave is the ocean. You just look at the world. One wave is not the ocean, but one wave is all ocean all the time. You see, it's tricky. So they didn't buy that subtlety. But what he was saying is everything has the divine in it, and therefore you treat it all as sacred. How could we do what we do if we had that idea that God is in me and I am in God? In other words, the I am in God part means it's a much bigger thing than me, although God is in me and I am in God. That in God thing is that, what we realize now as what the Buddhists would call interdependence. Uh, the we is much bigger and different than the me. It's tricky. You gotta do a little meditating on that. Maybe that'll be what you meditate on. Now, when we shift over in a minute to actually me stopping talking, thank goodness, and then just being in the silence, we're going into a different area. I got a couple of short poems from the Book of the Heart. And this is in the very first section, if you have the book, on page 10, if you have the book. Can you do this? Can you wake up as a wave? The soul that wants nothing but God must forsake everything, even God. As long as we have and know who God is, we don't. We are far away. So can we let our notions die? This is the smallest death a soul can undergo before it becomes divine. Can you let your notions of God die? This is the smallest death a soul can undergo before it becomes divine. This, at another place, he's famous for saying, I pray to God to rid me of God. Sounds insane at first, but what he's talking about is he prays to the ultimate reality to rid him of any kind of notion. And that's primarily what we do when we go into meditation. It doesn't matter what form. Certainly, form I practice now, that's not everybody's cup of tea, but it is mine, the centering prayer. You consent to lay aside for the time of the centering thinking and planning and doing. Just for 20 minutes, we're laying those aside. That doesn't mean thoughts won't be there. Doesn't mean plans won't be beckoning. Doesn't mean your to-do list isn't right there. It just means you're consenting for this time to do this little death that he's talking about. Can you let your notions die? This is the smallest death a soul can undergo before it's born as reborn as the divine. You've got to let it go. So that's part of it. And then one other one that I think is it's very interesting. There is a language so beautiful that it is never spoken. There's a language so beautiful that it is never spoken. Um, Thomas Keating, who taught me and started the centering prayer movement, he said, God speaks every language, but God's favorite is silence. It's another language. I just rewatched Arrival. If you've ever seen the Amy Adams movie about aliens coming down, and she's a linguist, and you got to really see it if you haven't seen Arrival. It's a great movie. You won't see it just once, but the learning of the language of these other beings changed her totally. When you learn a foreign language, it changes your whole view of the world. You see, I really recommend seeing the movie Arrival. You can see it free if you got cable. You don't have to pay for it. And I think it's one of the great movies I've ever seen because it's exactly the problem we have when in a minute, we'll go into silence. We're not used to that language. It is the ultimate language. Yeah. Ultimate reality is silence. And if you learn to speak it, this goes on. There is a language so beautiful that it is never spoken. There is a deep sort of silence, and he's talking there about the silence of contemplation. There's a deep sort of silence that may never adequately fall into words. That, I tell you, is more valuable than any jewel or any diamond. There is a deep sort of silence that may never adequately fall into words. If you do this kind of experiment of dropping into the silence and letting thoughts be thoughts, but you're not thinking them, letting plans be plans, but you're not planning them. And if you let the to-do list be the to-do list, but then you don't get caught up in trying to figure out which one to do first, and we all do that every time. I do it every time. I fall it. I go for the bait, hooked. And then when I realize I'm hooked, I unhook. Every tradition has a way. I go back to the breath. I have a sacred word that helps me unhook, and then I'm back in that ocean of silence. And over time, that's what it means to learn the language. It sees how you get hooked on the language of the surface of life. So let's give it a try. So we'll go for 20 minutes all told, but there'll be a second tone, a Middle Eastern oud will sound, and that means you got 5 minutes of silence left. And if you so choose, you can pick up the pen and write. Yeah, so let's try to go for 15 minutes of just being in the silent language for a while, and then come out of that and go onto the page with whatever comes. If that, you might, oftentimes I'll sit the last five too. It's up to you, but know that's an option. Okay, well, bon voyage. I guess we could stop the tape.